Hello, everyone, and welcome to Papa Hector's podcast. So, today's episode is called Designer Spirituality. How shallow will you go? So, before I get into that, first off, if you haven't already done so, you might want to check out my blog because I gave a sneak peek of my new book, 21 Divisions, Mysteries and Magic of Dominican Voodoo. And the book is available for pre-order now on Amazon, IndieBound, as well as Barnes & Noble. And you may want to get that because, hey, orders have been quickly piling up, the publisher has told me, and they are ready. So that's awesome. And the book will be coming out May 1st, 2020. So, aside from that, make sure you subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor.fm, Stitcher, or Spotify. Likewise, you can subscribe to me at my YouTube channel, Instagram, or Facebook. Look at hunganhector.com or hectorsalva.com, HECTORSALVA.com. So it's been a while since I did my last podcast. I didn't even realize how long it had been since I did my last podcast. It's been an incredibly busy month with ceremonies and rituals, etc., all the month of November 2019. So I'm glad to be back here with you guys, giving you this podcast. So today, what we're going to discuss is designer spirituality. How shallow can we get? Okay, so right now, there's a huge movement towards spirituality and being quote-unquote woke or conscious. But unfortunately, as many things are happening in this day and age, everything is done or everything is taken in a very shallow way, and in some of the most shallow ways possible. And what's happening is you're ending up with a lot of quote-unquote spiritual people, okay, which have only barely stepped their toe in the water, that are offering services to others. And it's incredibly sad. In fact, in the past month, I've dealt with over a dozen individuals that have real spiritual gifts and have undergone severe trials and tribulations dealing with designer spiritualists. Designer spirituality is a very shallow form of spirituality in which people just touch the surface and don't go very deeply or very far. In fact, I did a podcast not that long ago as to why you shouldn't burn sage. And I got a lot of interesting commentary on that by a lot of designer spiritualists. A lot of designer spiritualists got really offended that the truth was being spoken out there. And I'm going to do a little Q&A at the end of this because people have asked me some questions and I want to make some responses as far as that's concerned. However, because of designer spirituality is why we have the problems with sage and hierba santa or palo santo, frankincense, and many of the other natural resources that are getting eaten up and messed up by individuals. Also, because of designer spirituality, you have tons of people out there teaching, coaching, quote-unquote helping individuals, and they may actually believe that they're doing these things, but in actuality are making things worse and worse and worse. The funny thing is that I grew up in these spiritual traditions, and I can remember a time in which you could meet a brujo or a spiritual worker, and you would not see another one for miles and miles and miles and miles and miles. Nowadays, anyone who can light a candle is a brujo, is a spiritual worker. Anybody who knows how to use a lighter is a spiritual worker. And unfortunately, our communities are suffering because of this heavily. Designer spirituality seeks to remove all of the spirit from spirituality. A lot of designer spirituality is based on self-help and upon how great and wonderful you as a person are. And unfortunately, here in the West, designer spirituality is all about commercialization and the removal of God and spirit from spirituality. Here in the West, people don't like realizing that God and spirit actually run things. Here in the West, you have a huge sense of entitlement that says that you are the authority, commander, and doer of all, when in reality there are powers above you, above your conscious mind, and above what you could ever even conceive of. Designer spirituality is the reason why crystals are selling, is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and are selling at all types of rates really quickly at the speed at which they can't be the earth can't produce. Okay. Unfortunately, this is causing a great deal of unhappiness and problems within the spiritual community. It's causing a great deal of problems and issues within the spiritual community because everyone or anyone who's picking up a little book, reading a few sentences, is able to light a candle, picks up a sage stick at Whole Foods, buys a quartz or a rose crystal. Now they're a spiritual worker, a spiritualist, and they have the power. The truth is, that's not how it works. In this day and age, a lot of spirituality is very shallow and surface level spirituality. This can be easily seen by those quote unquote spiritualists doing that work. Many of their lives and their health reflects it. I've seen tons and tons of quote unquote spiritual workers who have anxiety, paranoia, health issues, love and relationships, cyclical issues, problems that should not be there if they're helping others. A spiritualist is not meant to be perfect. A spiritualist will have problems, even if he's meant to work for others. Okay? However, there are certain foundational issues that should not be present at all whatsoever. There are certain things that should not be there if that person is there to help others. There's no possible way to properly help others. Very few people realize how much even a psychic reading can mess someone up. Improper information, giving someone the improper information and an improper map of what to expect and how to live their life, really can cause a great deal of problems in a domino effect. It can cause a whole bunch of other issues. As an example, like I said, within the past month, I've met a number of people that have spiritual gifts, but unfortunately, they interfaced with designer spiritualists, shallow spiritualists, people who claim to be spiritual workers but are not spiritual workers, have only touched their toes on the surface of the water. And what this has done, okay, is cause these individuals more grief, more headache, and more loss. Why? Because a lot of times these individuals were improperly diagnosed because the spiritualists, the quote unquote spiritualists, didn't know what the hell they were doing. And then from being improperly diagnosed, improper treatment, which just made their problems worse. Which really just made their problems worse. And it's a very sad thing that these days, anyone and everyone who can light a candle is turning around and saying, hey, I'm a spiritual worker, I'm a spiritualist, I'm a brujo. In the old time, that was a very serious claim to make, and not something that people would make lightly. That's number one. Number two is, as we've always known, being able to work some magic and do a few, as I call them, parlor tricks, magical things, does not make one a brujo. It does not make someone a spiritual worker. It doesn't mean someone is meant to be a spiritual worker. And unfortunately, a lot of people, they don't know what it is they're meant to be doing spiritually. There's a lot of jobs in the spiritual realm. There's enough to go around without everyone claiming to be a brujo or a spiritual worker. And it's really unfortunate because a lot of times these part-time, untrained, quote-unquote brujos and spiritual workers are really messing people up. They're really causing a great deal of problems, and clients and individuals who are really trying to resolve their life end up with 2, 3, 4 times the amount of problems than before they even tried to get help. Many people confuse costumes with spirituality. I see this all the time. A lot of quote-unquote spiritualists, designer spiritualists, are more worried about what they look like and how they're dressed. Okay? Spirituality has almost become like a Halloween. A time to play dress up. And a lot of people, being guided by one's physical eyes, fall into these traps. How will you know someone is a spiritual, enlightened being? How would you know someone is spiritually advanced? The truth is that there's nothing visible. Meaning that a true spiritualist, a truly enlightened being, doesn't need to make a big display in how they dress and how they present themselves in order to be advanced. In fact, many people who are advanced will not make a big display. There's no need to dress up in funny costumes and wear all kinds of things in order to display one's spirituality. And oftentimes, those individuals who display their spirituality the loudest are the least advanced. Not all the time, but oftentimes. Again, not all the time, but oftentimes. Individuals who are like parading around in costumes, treating this as a spiritual Halloween, are often need to do that because spiritually they're not that advanced. And unfortunately, for many individuals starting on these paths, all they have to guide them is their physical eyes. All they have in order to understand things is their physical eyes. And because of this, we get the very unfortunate situation, where tons of these people are being taken advantage of, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. Some of these designer spiritualists are not malintended, but are not trained, and are filled with ego, are filled with so much ego that they actually can't really help people. There's so much ego behind it. And the funny thing is that ego is another thing that is hard for a non-advanced spiritual worker to really see. But someone who is advanced can see clearly where the ego is the motivating force, and where it's what's moving things, and where it is that there's truth. But again, that's not something that happens for someone who is not advanced spiritually, who hasn't developed their spiritual eyes. And so ego can often be very deceiving. A lot of people following the path of designer spirituality hop from workshop to workshop, teacher to teacher, thing to thing to thing, and wonder why they're not actually making true, deep improvements in their life. True, deep improvements in their life. The truth is, there's many paths to God. There's many paths to the Great Spirit and the divine. And it matters not so much the specific path, but it does matter that you're making progress. Everyone has become spellcasters, spiritual workers, etc., based on, unfortunately, many falsities. To truly be a spiritual worker that has true capacity to really help others takes a deep commitment, but also lots of training and development, lots of evolution. This cannot happen when you've just started upon the path. There's currently individuals that I see out there offering spiritual work to people, or doing spiritual work for people, that are not right themselves, or don't even have the training, the knowledge, or the know-how how to do these things properly. But they're still offering, and they're still selling, because unfortunately, for he who doesn't know, he doesn't know that he doesn't know. And he doesn't know, he knows so little that he thinks he knows, and he doesn't even know how little it is that he actually knows. And for someone who doesn't know at all, they're often going to end up falling prey and falling victim to these individuals who are out there who have just started the path themselves, who have just begun the walk. There's a big, big, big movement right now towards not committing to one's spiritual path, and therefore not committing to a spirituality, and being eclectic or freeform. And there's a huge ego amongst people in the spiritual community that they don't want to learn from anyone else. They think that they're too good to learn from other individuals. Okay? And this causes a great lack of knowledge. Okay? The ego that says they're too good to learn causes them not to learn and therefore not to know. And it also causes them to go into practices that often cause them harm themselves. Many people offering spiritual services out there are also constantly dealing with spiritual attack, are being spiritually attacked, have negative spirit attachments, aren't able to deal with energies, have anxiety, paranoia, or any other mental condition. There are many mental conditions that people end up having. Financial problems and really bad luck, as well as relationship issues. And the inability to really have good relationships. And as they continue doing the spiritual work, these things continue to happen and snowball and get worse and worse. But their ego likes to know that they're helping people, when in reality they're not helping anyone or themselves. Designer spirituality, Gucci spirituality, Fendi Prada spirituality is what I call it. Okay? Is very shallow and doesn't give you the true transformative, the true transformations, the true transformative changes. They're not able to make deep transformative changes that really changes their life. So if you want to really transform and change your life, you need to go into deep water. You need to have depth behind your spirituality. And the efforts of such will benefit you. Your efforts in doing such will benefit you. You'll start to experience and see those real changes. So, I hope that this has awakened you to some extent of what's going on there in the community with designer spirituality. And it's a very severe epidemic. And this is something that spiritualists, true spiritualists, are aware of and have been aware of for a long time. That there would be a time where it would seem as though people are becoming more spiritual, more open, more awoke, more woken up. But that many of these individuals would be misguided, and many false prophets and false teachers would come about to basically take advantage of the need that exists for people to have a true direct connection with the divine and live one's purpose. And this was warned to us a long time back. And so it's no surprise to us now. So watch out. Watch out who you work with spiritually. Watch out. Watch out to see. See what's really there. Before you put your life in the hands of someone who doesn't know, who could just potentially make it worse. So now on to a little Q&A. So first off, it was absolutely funny and awesome to see that on my sage video, which is called Why You Shouldn't Burn Sage, right? I received tons of comments from angry sage users as to why I was a negative individual. Here's the thing, my dears. The video is titled Why Not to Use Sage. It's not titled Why You Should Use Sage. That's number one. Number two, obviously, my dear, the sage isn't working for you. I've had people put comments that were really nasty and negative towards me about that video because basically you're a sage user and abuser, and obviously it's not working because you wouldn't have been so nasty and negative about sage, about what I said about sage, right? So obviously it's not working. Secondly, many people didn't understand the fact of what I was saying, in that I told a story about how someone saged themselves to protect themselves and ended up getting killed. The point of the story is not that sage caused it. The point is that sage is not made to protect you. And things used improperly will either have negative effects or no effects. So if you're using sage as a form of protection, sage is not used for protection and can't protect you. So it renders it ineffective. The next question that I received was, why does everyone think they're a brujo? Unfortunately, everyone thinks they're a brujo because people don't really understand what it really means to be a real brujo. Okay? To be a real brujo. And the great thing is, if you do go out and purchase my book, you're going to learn a lot about what is a real brujo. Someone else asked me, basically, like, can one lose their spiritual gifts or does it stay with them forever? One can lose one's spiritual gifts because it's given by God. However, one does not usually lose them, and it usually stays with one forever. Another question that I received on my YouTube was, what's the difference between 21 divisions and Lukumi? There are huge differences between 21 divisions and Lukumi that I can't totally answer everything in this podcast because there's so many differences. But one of the biggest differences are the spirits that we work with. The spirits that are worked with in Lukumi only come from one African nation. The spirits that we work with in the 21 divisions come from many different African nations and Indian spirits, so on and so forth. So that's one of the biggest differences. Alongside of that, there are many other differences, and perhaps I will get to that at some point in another video or something. Another comment that I had was, about the sage again, basically saying that, this person says that their religion was stolen from them mentally and stolen from their ancestors. And so that's why they use sage. If it was stolen from you mentally, then you don't know what you're doing. And if it was stolen from your ancestors, then your ancestors couldn't have taught you properly. Okay? There are ancestors that were willing to die in order to protect their beliefs and pass them down. So, this is what happens when you use designer spirituality. Okay? Your ancestors, as wonderful as they may be, as wonderful as the ancestors are, okay, not all of the ancestors fought for their beliefs. Not all of the ancestors fought for their people. Many ancestors, many people's ancestors, converted to Christianity. Many people's ancestors were also the reason why many other people's ancestors were sold out and dead. And sold out for practicing spiritualities. Okay? Just because you have ancestors like everyone else doesn't mean you had good ancestors or that your ancestors stuck by the spiritual path. In fact, many ancestors let go of the spiritual path, sold themselves out, and didn't continue these practices. That is why there's a huge epidemic in our minority communities where lots of people within our own communities consider anyone who do this practice devil worshippers. So if it was mentally stolen from you and your ancestors, and you have proper respect for the spirits and proper respect for the traditions, then you go and you do things properly. If you actually have respect. Respect is not just a word. It's an action. If you have proper respect and you go and learn how to do things properly because you have respect for the spirits. Having something taken away from you is not an excuse for then you to basically substitute and basically do BS, do nonsense to replace what you don't know. So I hope that this vid or this podcast has clarified all of that for everyone. And as always, leave me comments, leave me notations. I'd love to hear it, the good, the bad, the ugly. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast at Apple iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor.fm, Stitcher, or Spotify. Make sure to check me out on YouTube, Hungan Hector, and check us out on the site, HectorSalva.com, HectorSalva.com. Sign up for the newsletter, and if you haven't already done so, go ahead and check out the sneak peek of the book. It's special just for you guys. So, God bless, and many, many blessings. Keep the faith.